It's the Politics with Paul podcast. I'm your host, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to talk about the funnel of causality. Have you ever wondered why some people vote the way they do? Or maybe you wonder what exactly influences you to vote the way you do. Enter the funnel of causality. It's a diagram that lists all the internal and external forces in the short term, medium term, and long term that are then distilled into what our vote choice is. And these forces are pictured as, you guessed it, a funnel where there's a really big opening where you throw in all these factors impacting the vote. You get to the narrow end, and then boom, you have vote choice. While you were young, you may have been taught that during elections we all come together, pensively debate the choices on our ballot in our minds, and then come to the most informed decision that we possibly can. In reality, however, none of us are 100% independent in our thought processes where we eschew any potential biases. That's why we represent the ultimate reasons for vote choice as a funnel. It's a representation of how we filter all the information coming into our brains, even if we don't consciously think about all of it. We all have these factors that go in to influence our vote, whether we realize it or not. So, what's the story behind the development of the funnel of causality? What does it look like? How does it work? And why should you care? That's what's on tap for today's episode. I actually wrote an article about this on medium.com way back, like, I don't know, 2019. It's definitely not as in-depth as what this is going to be. So I'm going to include a link on that article to this episode, and I'll include an article to include a link to that article in the show notes for this episode. But this is going to be a lot more in depth. So if you are coming from that Medium article, thank you so much for reading and coming to check out the podcast. But to get into the origins of the funnel of causality, we must go all the way back to the school of thought that is commonly dubbed the Columbia School, named after Columbia University. There was polling before then, but that didn't really delve much into the reasons for people's vote choices. Just mostly was just who are people voting for and what do they think about some of these issues, but not really diving into that's why they are voting for so and so. That modern, what we call modern academic study of voting research, why people vote the way they vote, can be traced back to 1940 to a group of researchers from Columbia University, hence Columbia School. They were headed by the venerable Paul Lazarsfeld, who's an Austrian-born social scientist who founded Columbia University's Bureau of Applied Social Research. And on his team, he also included Bernard Berelson and Hazel, hopefully I'm going to say this correct, Goudet. Berelson was the head of the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University, and Goudet was a pioneer in the field of political psychology and also notable for being a female social scientist at a time when there were very few. And it's only a couple of decades after women gained the right to vote through the 19th Amendment. So during the 7 months leading up to the 1940 presidential election, the election that year, which was Franklin D. Roosevelt versus Wendell Willkie, and then FDR went on to win his third term. The researchers tracked a sample of 600 people from Erie County, Ohio. So a decent sample, but only from one town. And there were multiple interviews over time so that they could make these cross sections of how exactly people's votes changed or didn't change over time. And that led to the groundbreaking book called The People's Choice: How the Voter Makes Up His Mind in a Presidential Campaign. In short, the 1940 study's results said that the actual campaign, so newspaper articles or newspaper ads, radio ads in general, and so on, had little to no effect on individuals. The actual campaign didn't seem to matter. What actually mattered was the brand loyalties based on religion and social class, and these interpersonal interactions with their friends and family. It was this, if you ever heard the phrase demography is destiny, it didn't originate from here, but it was kind of emblematic of that philosophy of whatever your demographics are, that's going to determine what exactly you think and how life works for you. The Columbia group then would follow that up. Instead of Goudet, though, they brought on William and McPhee. They followed it up with a study into the 1948 presidential election, which was Harry Truman and Thomas Dewey. Now, you may remember that uh, for the infamous picture of Harry Truman holding a newspaper, erroneously declaring ahead of time that Thomas Dewey won the election because polling at the time did not track a lot of these undecided voters in the 2 weeks leading up to the election, and there was a surge for what seemed to be a surge for Harry Truman, and he would go on to defeat Thomas Dewey. So McPhee was William N. McPhee. Columbia University says he invented the first computer simulation model of voting, and so he was brought on. And then they published another highly influential book called Voting, a study of opinion formation in a presidential campaign. And this time they studied Elmira, or is it Elmira? I'm not sure, but Elmira, New York, or Elmira, New York. Uh, and they sort of refined that 1940 study. They brought on, or they paid more attention to political issues, how respondents perceived or misperceived their favorite candidate's issue stands when they conflicted with the respondents' own views. So, how did they take this whenever a candidate had a different view from them? How exactly did they respond? Did they filter it and say, "Oh, well, actually, the candidate really actually agrees with my point of view because of this and this," or, "Well, I still like this candidate." Basically, how did they rationalize all that? And downplayed the role of the parties and the mass media again, and emphasized conformity of their social networks and increasing said conformity over the course of the 1948 presidential campaign. So once again, did not seem like people were really changing their minds much. So it was that whole interpersonal interactions with people in their religious and social class groups. So the short way to describe the Columbia School is that their model was rooted in sociology. Once again, it's that largely suggesting that demography is destiny. But like all pioneering work in a field of study, there were shortcomings. There was a lot more to people's choices than just the sociological aspects, and those would get built upon after the Columbia studies, especially by a group known as the Michigan School. And their work was largely in the 1950s and 1960s. And so they built upon the findings of the Columbia School, and this originated with the work of the University of Michigan's Angus Campbell and Robert Kahn. And at the time, they weren't really trying to follow up on what Columbia was studying necessarily. They were surveying foreign policy attitudes in 1948 for the university's Survey Research Center. And they compared these attitudes with whether they planned to vote in the 1948 election, again, Harry Truman versus Thomas Dewey, and which party they were voting for. So not only which candidate they were voting for, but whether they were voting at all. And then so they would re-interview these voters after the election too, and this is the way that the University of Michigan has described it. I think this is their exact wording at the time, but three basic reasons that they were doing this. It was to analyze the crystallization of the vote, record personal, attitudinal, and demographic characteristics of voters and non-voters, Republicans and Democrats, and three, assess the influence of various psychological, sociological, and political factors on the determination of the vote. And this 1948 study would spawn the Michigan election studies, which still go on every presidential and midterm elections, but now they're called the American National Election Studies, or ANES for short. And these have been very, very influential and informative about why people think the way they do when it comes to their vote choice. So we still see those conducted even today. And they were successive studies built on top of each other to compare cross sections of the past and the future. So not only seeing, or not just how is a vote changing over time for a specific campaign like the Columbia University studies were doing, but the Michigan school was sort of forward thinking. So every 2 years when we have a federal election, or at least a regularly scheduled federal election, how are people's opinions on these various questions that get asked time and time again in successive elections? How are people's opinions changing on that? And so, as the Michigan studies kept going on for federal elections throughout the 1950s, Angus Campbell brought on several figures that would become vital figures in the development of the Michigan model of voter behavior. And that included predominantly Syracuse University grad student Warren Miller. He would later found the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research in 1962, and that's, or the ICPSR for short. And there's a lot of political data that we get from them in terms of voter behavior, elections, and so on. Yale grad student Donald Stokes, who would later become a dean at Michigan and then at Princeton University, and then Michigan's very own Philip Converse from the school's social psychology program. And he would later go on to write the seminal work, The Nature of Belief Systems and Mass Publics, which was a comparison of how the ideological views work together for elites compared to regular people, and basically said that regular people don't have a lot of stability in their political views, whereas elites being people who are involved heavily in politics, who are actually elected, their political views tend to stay pretty rigid. So Angus Campbell brought on Miller, Stokes, and Converse, and using data from the Michigan election studies for the 1952 and 1956 presidential elections, which were both won by Dwight Eisenhower, they wrote the landmark book, The American Voter, which is regarded by some people as the most important book in the history of electoral research. And they distinguished between long-term and short-term vote forces, and they really emphasized the importance of attachment to a political party, with a caveat. Party loyalties and social characteristics are relatively stable, but don't account for short-term shifts in partisan division of the vote. So what before we weren't really accounting for, well, what happens, or why would a Republican vote for the Democratic candidate, or why would a Democrat vote for the Republican candidate? Previous studies didn't really get into that. And so this attachment to the political party, basically how strongly do you identify as a Democrat or as a Republican? It was used to explain how Eisenhower won landslide victories as a Republican for president, but a plurality of voters were still Democrats. And if you look at Congress and uh, how the partisan divide for Congress was, it was very routinely a Democratic majority, oftentimes pretty sizable Democratic majorities. There were a few times that Republicans would break the majority in either the House or the Senate, but at that time, Congress very much routinely broke Democratic. And then sometime in the 1950s began a 40-year streak where Democrats had the majority in the U.S. House. And much of this party loyalty of Eisenhower's time was traceable to the New Deal by FDR, which was that system of political and economic programs that FDR and his administration pushed for and mostly succeeded in getting implemented back during the Great Depression. And this study by the Michigan University researchers, it also weighed attitudinal forces toward Eisenhower, toward his opponent Adlai Stevenson, relevant social groups, parties as managers of government and how people perceive the parties as stewards of government, domestic issues, and foreign policy issues, along with Eisenhower's popularity. Because you got to remember, also Eisenhower was a war hero. He had served in World War II and had been one of the leading commanders during D-Day. And so, with the Columbia University, or the Columbia School, as it's called, solely focused on the sociological aspects, the Michigan School built upon that and blended both sociology and psychology, so socio-psychological factors. Most relevantly for this podcast episode, though, The American Voter by Campbell, Miller, Stokes, and Converse used the metaphor of the funnel of causality. So the funnel of causality was not invented by the Columbia School. It became later on a thing from the Michigan School. So there's that little bit of a history lesson for you. So now more to the actual funnel of causality. What exactly goes into it? So the basic premise is, picture a funnel. On the large open end, the wide end, you have these long-term overarching forces shaping who you are. They affect how you perceive the short-term choices, or short-term forces, excuse me, later on down the funnel. So then as you go to the narrow end of the funnel, you get to the short-term forces. So these are more specifically related to the issues and the candidates. The funnel is also a representation of time. That large, wide end of the funnel is your baseline, sort of the start of the timeline, those forces that begin shaping your general political views. And then the narrow end is, as the campaign goes on, it starts to ultimately shape your vote choice as the campaign keeps going on. And then you have your vote choice. So, voting behavior research has refined the study of vote choice over time, building on the work of the Columbia and Michigan teams. And ultimately, the funnel of causality is a model of voting behavior. And there are plenty of those that exist today that have built upon earlier work. Sometimes they're represented as a funnel as well, not always. You don't necessarily need to represent voting behavior as a funnel, but it's a common way to do it. And so there are some oft-used internal and external forces thrown in there in many conceptions of the funnel. Usually the way you see it, I say usually, I'll get to in a minute why there's not necessarily a specific way to envision the funnel of causality, but usually when you depict the funnel, the traits that are focused on the group characteristics, the external forces, are thrown into the wide end. And then the individual focus, the internal traits, are in the narrow end. So those group traits include things like your economic structure. So how well off is your economic outlook where you live and where people you know are. Uh, Obviously, that can fluctuate sometimes, but there are some places that are generally more well off, and then some places that are generally worse off. Your social divisions, so predominantly race and religion. You white, black, Asian, Hispanic, multiracial. In terms of religion, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, atheist, whatever the case may be. Historical patterns, so both of your own and of where you live. So are you in a place that is generally divided, Republican and Democrat? Do you live in a very Democratic place? Do you live in a very Republican place? How have you voted in the past? Have you routinely voted Democrat? Have you routinely voted Republican? Have you gone back and forth? Have you thrown in third parties and independents? Group loyalty. So you can think of that as your social identity. So how you identify with any of these groups. Is your race a strong part of your social identity? Your religion, your party, the value orientation. So the values that you share about family, or uh, how exactly the government should be involved in people's lives, or how little or if you think that it should be less involved in people's lives. And then your party attachment. So how strongly do you identify as a Democrat or a Republican, or do you identify with either one of them at all? The way we sometimes describe that is as what we call a weak Democrat or Republican and strong Republican or Democrat. It's not a value judgment. It's just a way to describe how closely you identify with that party. And these group traits are sometimes referred to as political cleavages, which are social or cultural dividing lines that break societies into different groups with different political views. So those are very influential a lot of times on what people vote as, especially like if you're, for example, if you're from a black neighborhood, black voters typically vote Democratic. If you're a white male that goes to church, a lot of times you you tend to vote Republican. So those are examples of political cleavages. Individual traits include where you get your political news from. Do you watch Fox News, CNN, MSNBC? Uh, do you get it from a different source? Issue opinions and those sources. I mean, there's a myriad of sources that you can get your news from, and plenty of them have a very heavy bias one way or another. Your issue opinions. So, what do you think of abortion, guns, LGBT issues, foreign policy, all sorts of different issues, obviously. Perception of the candidate's image. So, how do you see Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, George Bush? That's starting to get a little way back there at this point. Wow, it's kind of amazing to think about. Some of those political figures are an eternity ago in political years, but what do you think of all of those candidates or political figures of yesteryear or today? So Chuck Schumer, Bernie Sanders, Mitch McConnell, your interaction with your family and your friends. So kind of going back to what the Columbia and the Michigan schools, but especially the Columbia school use, those interactions with your family and friends and how they shape your political opinions. Now, you're not necessarily going to agree with them, but they still can often impact what you think, because when you have a group that leans one way, it you not don't necessarily automatically take the same exact stances, but they will impact what you think to some degree. Your actual interactions with the campaign, whether it's president, U.S. Senate, U.S. House, state legislature, your local officials, whoever the case may be, your personal economic class. So, are you specifically well off, or are you poor, or are you middle class? You working class? So, just to reiterate, group characteristics, which tend to look at more external characteristics like your race and your social divisions of where you are, and your historical patterns of how the place you live votes, and then down to the more at the narrow end of the funnel, more internal, individual focused characteristics like your specific views on issues, domestic and foreign, or your perceptions of a candidate's image. So that's the basic way that the funnel is typically visualized as. But I said earlier that there's not really there's no one correct visualization of a funnel of causality. There isn't a true, this is exactly what the funnel looks like diagram. Why can't there be one true funnel of causality? And that's just because everybody feels the pull of different factors, or the same factors, but in different ways. Uh, a couple of the more common designs, but there are a couple of more common designs, but none that are 100% correct in every single situation or for every voter. There might be some overlap, and they aren't mutually exclusive, but there you do see some key differences. And I'm going to put up this common example of a funnel on the screen here, but you see at the wide end of the funnel, you see economic structure, social divisions, historical patterns. And then those start to feed into your group loyalty. Not necessarily, not specifically of your party, but your racial or religious groups or gender groups or whatever the case may be. Your value orientations, what values you specifically hold dear, and then group loyalty again being affected by those things. And then that starts to distill into your party attachment. And then coming from the outside is the government actions and the influence of friends. And then those start to feed into campaign activity, media influence, your specific issue opinions, which are, and all those are once again affected by your party attachment, your group loyalty, your value orientations, economic structures, social divisions, historical patterns. Issue, so it goes into issue opinions, then to candidate image, and then those can then be affected by the economic conditions and the political conditions. So not necessarily your specific economic status typically, but what about other outside forces? Maybe you lose your job. Maybe tariffs come in, because obviously tariffs have now become a big talking point with the Trump administration, and then other political conditions coming in. Whether there's from maybe where you live, maybe it's not very politically competitive. Maybe it is politically competitive. And then all those things come into your vote. So if you're able to see that on the screen, if you don't see it on the screen, or you're only listening to this, hopefully that was a reasonably explanatory look at it, just to really quick reiterate it to hopefully make more sense. Just in this specific example of the funnel, this is one of the common examples of a funnel of causality you see. At the wide end, economic structure, social divisions, historical patterns, those feed into group loyalty and value orientations, which then feed into your party attachment. And then your party attachment, along with government actions and influence of friends, then start to feed in and affect the campaign activity and how you perceive the campaign activity, how you perceive the candidates, your issue opinions, the media influence as well. Then those suddenly bring in, not suddenly, but those then you bring in the political conditions and the economic conditions, and then boom, you've got your vote choice. But once again, that's just one example of a funnel. That's not the only version of the funnel. And it's because as the funnel of causality is it's ultimately a model of voter behavior, we have a bunch of other models that we can compare as well. And these may not necessarily be represented as a funnel, but the funnel is a really good visualization for trying to describe a vote choice. So you have some other examples of voter behavior models. Is you got the rational choice theory, which assumes that people are all rational actors and analyze costs and benefits of a vote choice, and then they vote accordingly. Retrospective voting, which is quite simply, are you or your group doing well, usually economically? Then if you are doing well or your group's doing well, then you vote for the current party in power. And if they're not doing well, if you're not doing well, then you vote against the current party in power. So it's this system of rewards and punishments. And then you've got party line voting, which is simply people based or voting based on the level of attachment that they feel to their party. Are they very strongly Republican? Probably going to vote Republican up and down the ticket. If they feel strongly Democratic, they're probably going to vote Democrat up and down the ticket. In any case, though, whatever model you use, whatever funnel of causality, or if you don't use a funnel at all, whatever model you use to explain voter behavior is going to have some sort of shortcoming. And you can't explain 100% of all voting behavior for all people. If we take rational choice, not everyone is rational. Some people don't have great research skills. Campaigns can obfuscate their and their opponent's intentions and say, oh, then, my opponent's going to be trying to kill people or whatever they try to say to make you not vote for them. See how terrible and evil my campaign opponent is? And then the opponent will say, no, actually, it's the other guy that's terrible and evil. Retrospective voting. You don't necessarily assume that the party in power is responsible for your trying to think of the way, not dire state, but your state of, if you're not doing well, you might not necessarily assume that's the majority party in power. You may find that the minority party is what a lot of people across the political spectrum love to say about the opposition, is that they're obstructionist. And the real reason for the group not doing well. Lots of people still vote the same way every year, even if their economic or social state is not doing well. They still just vote the same way every year. Party line voting does not account for those times when a longtime voter finally, what some might say, quote unquote, gains a conscience and then votes against their party's nominee or nominees. And it's not common, but you do see it every once in a while. Or, not explain why people decide to sit on the sidelines in a given election where they just don't vote at all. And then for the overall funnel of causality, just funnels of causality in general, it doesn't necessarily account for the intensity of how any of these factors impact voting behavior. Maybe your loyalty to your group doesn't really affect your vote choice, or maybe your economic class doesn't really have as much of an impact as it does for another voter. But you must remember, though, that these are all models and they are not necessarily meant to describe how every nook and cranny works. They're not necessarily try to say, oh, this is exactly how it works 100% of the time. They're just models for you to try to better visualize why people think and choose the way they do. Now, just mentioned them just a moment ago. What about people that don't vote? Now, you can have all these factors that are attempting to influence you, what groups you belong to, your social divisions, your economic structure, even if you have a party or don't have a party. These attempts by these campaigns to try to influence you so that you vote for them, or try to get you to sort of activate your biases, so to speak, to make you get up and vote for that candidate. You can have all these things attempting to influence you, but sometimes you might not decide to vote. You might decide to not vote at all, or somebody else might decide not to vote at all. To the best of my knowledge, there is no funnel of causality for non-voters, but we can look at some of the specific factors in the funnel for some ideas of how non-voters would distill all those traits into their vote choice, or rather lack thereof. So, first of all, let's think about some of the reasons people give for why they don't vote. Some people feel they're not informed enough to make a decision, whether they just haven't had the time to research things, or they just don't know where to look, or just haven't put the effort in. Sometimes they're disgusted with all their vote choices. Now, that doesn't necessarily stop people from voting. Some people will vote for, quote unquote, the lesser of two evils. They might not know an election is happening. Now, for those of you who are regularly tuned into politics, or at least more than the average person, you might think, how can they not know an election is happening? You'd be surprised. Some people don't know that there's anything other than a presidential election going on, or they think that all elections for offices are happening during a presidential election. Some people don't know that elections in odd-numbered years happen sometimes. Not necessarily. It's not always the case. A lot of places where people live, there are no elections in odd-numbered years. I live in a place that does not have elections in odd-numbered years. They're preoccupied with other things in life. It's easy for those of us who are involved in politics for a living, like myself, to say, well, how can they not, get involved in this stuff, or try to research anything? There's all this is so important, but a lot of people got a lot of other stuff going on right now, and it may just take up a lot of their time, and they don't really get invested in politics, or they don't know where to look, or they don't want to have anything to do with politics because of how dirty and divisive it gets. They don't think their vote will matter, whether from a philosophical standpoint or a numerical standpoint. They say, oh, I'm just one in millions of people, or they They think philosophically that just hey, it doesn't matter how many people are voting. My vote is not going to matter because people are in office are just going to do whatever they want to do. Or they just simply don't care about politics. Those are just some reasons that people would decide not to vote. But now let's take some of those factors and apply them to the funnel of causality. Let's apply them to these reasons for non-voting. So if we look at historical patterns, for example, on that wide end of the funnel, a non-voter probably rarely or just never votes when they have had the opportunity to in the past. And if that's the case, they probably won't vote this time. If they've had, let's just say, 6 elections that they could have voted in previously, they didn't vote in any one of them. Probably not going to vote this time. Now, Barack Obama and Donald Trump have gotten some of those kinds of voters to actually turn out to vote for them in the past, but it's not a common thing. Party attachment. Non-voters usually don't have a strong party attachment. Those with strong party attachments vote at higher rates than those who do not have strong party attachments. So, independents, for example, third parties, but there are still registered Democrats and Republicans, a lot of them that don't turn out to vote. Maybe not necessarily every election, but will they will maybe only vote every other election or only in certain elections. Media influence. These are people who probably consume little to no political media whatsoever. Campaign activity. They probably have little to no interaction with campaigns. Maybe they're not actually being effectively reached by campaigns because you have all these campaigns that could spend all these millions and millions of dollars to try to reach people, but they might not have actually there might be a segment of the population that's just not being reached effectively. You can have all this money and spend it all to try to win an election, but it doesn't mean you're spending it effectively. So it may not be on the voters, it may be on the campaigns themselves. Issue opinions. Maybe these non-voters have a lot of ambivalence on issues, or they just don't think about them too much because they're not personally affected by some of these issues. Maybe it's a foreign policy issue. What if something's going on like with the Russian invasion of Ukraine or Israel and Gaza? Some voters might say, "Well, I don't really care about this because it doesn't personally affect me." That's how some voters see it. Influence of family and friends. Many of their family and friends might not be politically involved either. So they see that and they're like, okay, I don't care either. All sorts of different reasons. And I'm not trying to say that any of them are necessarily wrong or that they're bad or anything like that. It's just some of the reasons that people have for not voting. Now, personally, do I think that people should vote? Yeah, but I used to be one of these people who was more like, if you don't vote, you don't have a right to complain. Not really like that anymore. There's a lot of reasons why people don't vote, a lot of complexity, and they may care a lot about these things going on, but they don't feel like they're qualified to make a decision, for example, or they just have a lot of other stuff going on in life, and they really haven't had the time to research what's going on in politics, and especially today with everything that goes on, not just with AI, but campaigns in general trying to obfuscate what's really going on or what their candidates think. Uh, Sometimes it's just really hard for these people to really sift through these non-voters to sift through all the crap and say, okay, this is what's actually happening. So there's all sorts of reasons why people have, or that all sorts of reasons that people have for not voting that we should be a little bit more empathetic to. Not for everybody, but for some people that is the case. But in any case, why should you care about the funnel of causality? Why is it important for you to know? It's because too often we don't try to understand where people who think and choose differently than us, where they're coming from. You hear it all the time. These kinds of people are stupid. They're misguided. They're selfish. They're evil. All these negative characteristics that we assign to them, people that we don't even know. And it happens to all of us. A lot of us are like that. So conceptualizing this funnel of causality may help us to understand why others think the way they think. And we might become more empathetic because we, quite frankly, could use a lot more empathy in politics these days. And Republican, Democrat, independent, third party, we all could do with a little bit more understanding of each other, because we all have our own biases to contend with that impacts how we think. None of us are 100% completely independent in our thinking. We should strive to be. We should push as hard as we can to be as independent in our thinking as we possibly can be, regardless of whether we're we're with a Democrat, Republican, independent, third party, no party, whatever the case may be. We should strive to be completely independent in our thinking, but even when we don't realize it, we have mitigating factors, some of those general group characteristics that impact how we think, and then some of the more individual based factors that affect how we think. So really, each one of us has our own funnel of causality, even when we might have similar characteristics like our economic background, our typical voting patterns. How we perceive those things through our personal lens can differ. Maybe you have two different people that are from a middle class neighborhood, and they both have voted the same party each time. Maybe they're both Democrats or maybe they're both Republicans. But in one election, they actually vote differently. One continues to vote Democratic when they voted Democratic before. Maybe the other Democrat decided, for whatever reason, they're going to vote Republican this time. Same thing if you've got two Republicans from a middle class neighborhood and they've both voted Republican the whole time, but then one of them decides in this election, actually, I'm going to vote Democrat this time. There's all sorts of reasons they might do that. We all have different capabilities in researching candidates and issues, which can impact how any of these funnel factors impact us. The campaign activity might have a lot more impact on somebody who is not as well versed in how to research things. They just hear what the campaign tells them and they just take it at face value. Some funnel factors will have less impact on some people than others. Example, your party attachment. If you don't have a party at all, well, although you do have some of those independents who lean Republican or lean Democrat that are more Democratic or Republican than they might think they are. But then you also have Democrats and Republicans who are registered as such, but they don't really feel that strongly attached to their party. The influence of your family and friends. Maybe you don't find them as influential. If your family, some children, they'll just follow what their parents told them because that's what their parents told them. Some kids will be very rebellious and go the opposite way just to rebel against their parents. All sorts of different things. So all these the funnel of causality may look a lot different for each one of us. So just remember, there is no one true funnel of causality, because there's going to be different funnels and models of voting behavior that can help explain different people. So just something to keep in mind. In short, it's not necessarily important. You don't need to know specifically even if there was a true funnel, regardless of whether there was a true funnel, you don't need to necessarily know exactly how it works. You just need to have a general sense of how all these factors, both group oriented and individual oriented, come in and affect somebody's vote choice, because it's once again, it's about empathy and understanding where people are coming from. And all of us can fall short in that regard. But just try to be a little bit more understanding of why people think the way they do. Doesn't mean you can't debate with them or say that they're wrong, or you can't call out people or anything like that. But it's just something to keep in mind, because none of us have all the answers. All of us are contending with our own biases. And some people don't really try to look past those biases, but some of us do. In any case, we all should try to understand people a little bit more. But in any case, that is today's episode on the funnel of causality. So, once again, as always, to all of you, thank you so much for listening, watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, share the podcast with all the people you know. Help this channel grow. Help this whole thing I'm trying to do with striving to be as nonpartisan as possible and try to be as informative as possible. Help spread that message, help spread the word about the podcast and all my other work. Speaking of which, in the show notes, Facebook, LinkedIn, my educational email course. It's about a series of 6 emails about mistakes we make when trying to depolarize politics, why we make those mistakes, and how we can go about correcting those mistakes, because sometimes when we try to depolarize politics, we actually make it worse. And I talk about some of those reasons. My book, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Become More Competitive. And I'll also link my original article about the funnel of causality on Medium down below as well. But that's going to do it for today's episode. So, as always, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, take care.